Let me tell you this little story first, because I think this is a good place to start. A man and his son were coming home from a soccer game one Saturday afternoon, and they were involved in a head-on collision. The father was killed instantly. The son was taken to a nearby hospital in critical condition. They wheeled him up into the operating room. The surgeon walked in, took one look at the boy, and said, "I can't operate on him. That's my son." So that's the story. Is there a problem with that story? Is that simple? What's going on with that story?
It's confused me, if I'm honest.
Good. That's the point. Listen, I've told this story to many thousands of people over the years, and that's the standard response that I get from everybody is there's some problem with that story. But what I want to emphasize is the reason there is an apparent problem with that story is because I chose my words very carefully, and one of the words there carries an unconscious assumption with it. And that assumption is incorrect in this case, but because the assumption is unconscious, your analysis of the story is colored by this unconscious, erroneous assumption. And as long as that assumption remains in place, then this will continue to be paradoxical and problematic. But because of the unconscious assumption that you're operating on, it appears to be a problem. Does that make sense? I mean, I don't suppose that has answered it for you, but you understand what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I do.
And the problem is that it's an unconscious assumption that's coded in language, okay? And in fact, this is sort of a trivial example, but it brings the emotional point home of the feeling that you're having of confusion and this paradox and what's going on and the need to solve the problem, when in fact there is no problem to be solved. It's an apparent problem created by an erroneous assumption. So let me lead you through the logic of this story. And the logic is so obvious, it's painful when you see it. Well, of course, this is less true than it used to be, but today, in 2010, most people have two parents, one male, one female. If the male is dead, the surgeon is who?
Yes, the surgeon's obviously the female.
Yes, it's his mother, the most obvious thing in the world. And yet, the word surgeon carries this assumption of maleness with it. Now, we weren't ever taught that that's true. And of course, it is true statistically. Probably, 90%, maybe 95% of surgeons probably are men. It's not a bad assumption under certain circumstances, but in this particular case, it creates the illusion of a paradox. But instead of people looking to their own assumptions to solve a problem, they usually end up looking in the world for the solution and never question their own assumptions. So what Gendo is about, and what the 5 stupidities are all about, unconscious assumptions, unconscious erroneous assumptions that are imposed on our thinking because of the words we use. So the 5 stupidities, each one of them, in some cases a specific word or a group of words or a class of words, impose assumptions, erroneous assumptions on our thinking, but because it's all unconscious, people just go through life facing all sorts of apparent problems and paradoxes that really aren't paradoxes at all, but they have that appearance because people have this little voice in their head that's talking at them, and it's full of erroneous assumptions. So does all that make sense?
It's so simple when it's pointed out.
Let me go on to the first and most dangerous of the 5 stupidities then. This word is the most common word in English. Do you know what it is?
The.
Yes. 1,000 times a day we formulate sentences with the word the in them. The is, without a doubt, it's like 5 times more frequent than the next most common word. It accounts for 6% of all printed English text. That's 6 words in 100 in a language that has 30,000 words in common usage and 500,000 or more total. One word accounts for 3 in 50. And in fact, it's carrying an unconscious assumption with it that is wrong about 90% of the time. Well, occasionally it's right, but usually it's wrong. So rather than me just tell you what it is, I'm curious if you can think about the word the for a minute and try to figure out what it is that's so dangerous about that word. What is the unconscious assumption? So let me give you another example. If I tell you to go into the next room and get me the green chair, how many green chairs do you expect to find in that room?
Yeah, I mean, if there's more than one green chair, then which
You'd
one?
be confused. Yeah, right. So when I say, otherwise I'd say, get me a green chair. So the word the carries this assumption of singleness and exclusivity. If you say, get me the car out of the garage, well, I hope there's only one car in the garage, or else we're going to have a problem. You know, and the other thing is, have you ever done any computer programming?
No, I haven't.
No, okay. Well, you've probably worked with databases, though. Like, I remember a long time ago, when I first got a computer, I made a database of all the people I knew. And in a database, they have an option called a default value. For instance, since I lived in California, and almost everybody I knew lived in California, whenever I added somebody to my address book, when I got to the place where it said state, my database program would automatically put California in there for me. I mean, I told it to do that because I knew that almost everybody I knew was in California. Once in a while, I'd meet somebody from out of state, and I'd have to backspace over CA and type in something else, if AZ for Arizona or whatever. But it saved me a great deal of time because 95% of the time it was right. And once in a while it was wrong, and that wasn't much of a problem. So that's the concept of a default value. Language, English, has default values. For instance, as I talk to you right now, there certainly isn't time for me to sit here and be thinking what I'm actually going to say in my next sentence and deciding what words I'm going to pick and how I'm going to articulate them and get my breathing worked up so that I could, put the stresses on the right syllables and get all the words strung together in the right order so it actually sounds like a real sentence and get my tongue and my larynx all coordinated with all this shit. There's no way that can happen consciously. So essentially, my talking and your talking and everybody's talking is really an automatic function of our language machine. We have this feeling of some control over it, but actually on a moment-to-moment basis, it's actually all being run by a machine which has a lot of default values. And if you are using a sentence that requires either a or an or the, to be proper in English, certain words have default values to the. You've probably never heard anybody ask you, what's a truth about this situation? You've never heard those words come out of anybody's mouth.
Yeah.
Am I right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And in fact, actually, if you say it yourself, out loud, what's a truth about this situation? Go ahead and say it. I'm curious. I want to test something.
What's a truth about this situation?
When you said, what's a truth? At least for me, it almost sticks in my throat. Yeah. I want to say, what's the truth about this situation?
Yeah, I was consciously trying to say
because if you're not really conscious, it's just automatically going to come out, what's the truth? Without ever thinking. So this is what I mean by default values in English. Now the question is there any such thing as the truth? For instance, say I've got a ball on my table. That's about as simple a thing as you can get. Does it make sense to ask about what's the truth about this ball? If I say it's a red ball, is that the truth or a truth?
I suppose it's a truth, because if it's the truth, then all it is a red ball. It prevents it from being anything else. So it could be,
it prevents it from being a wooden ball or a rubber ball or a big ball or a small ball.
So I think I'm getting what you're saying here. So what it does is when you're using the, or instead of say the truth instead of a truth, is that when you say the truth, it can only be that and nothing else. So
what about the reason? What's the reason that something happened?
Yeah.
Nonsense. There's no such thing as the reason, the truth. What about the answer? What's the answer? In fact, if I said, what's the answer to 2 plus 2?
Yeah.
Or no, let's say 1 plus 1. Is that proper to say what's the answer to 1 plus 1?
In that case, there's only one answer to 1 plus 1. Well, I don't know.
Really? Only one? Are you sure? Well, if you haven't done programming and you don't know a lot about computers, it wouldn't be obvious, but there are different base systems in math. We use binary math in computers. In computers, 1 plus 1 equals 10.
Right, I see. Yeah, I didn't know that. Yeah.
So it depends on what base system you're using, the answer to that question. If you're using regular old base systems, base 10, then 1 plus 1 equals 2. And that is the answer in base 10. But in a binary system, 1 plus 1 equals 10, and that's the answer in binary. So even that, there's an assumption underlying these things that is often unspoken. 1 plus 1 equals 2 is assuming base 10, which is a logical assumption. The problem is when you get into science and philosophy and politics and stuff, there are far more complicated situations where the assumptions are less obvious and more complex and just gets into all sorts of problems. And how often have you heard people say, well, that's just the way it is? Is that ever the truth? No. All it ever is a way of thinking about it. See, sometimes it's the way it is because your boss is your boss, and if he says it's that way, then it is because he's the guy who gets to make up the rules. But it's only that way because he says it's that way, not because it is that way. If your boss tells you to go find the answer to this problem, and then you go off and you start thinking and you come up with an answer, but you think it's the answer, well, then you can stop looking. You found the answer. But if you'd looked 5 minutes longer, you might have found 5 more answers that were even better. So yeah, it tends to end discussion, end exploration, and it also is used very dogmatically in the case of that's just the way it is. That's the world. The world really is that way. And this is it. And there's no more discussion. People use it from a sort of authoritarian perspective. But of course, the thing is, people don't actually use it. That's the problem. Like I said before, my talking right now, it's as much a surprise to me what's going to come out of my mouth in the next sentence as it is to you. I have no idea exactly what I was going to say. And my language machine is busy putting all this shit together for me. And yes, the default value in English is the for a great many words. In fact, all these reifications that I'll get into in a minute. The reason the word the is so important is because it happens hundreds of times a day. You know, that little voice in your head is going all the time. Blah, 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 blah. It's rehearsing what it's going to say when it sees somebody. It's thinking about what it should have said when I saw this guy yesterday, but I didn't. And it's thinking about what I'm going to have for lunch and what I'm going to do next week. And it's just this constant thing that's going on inside of our language machines. And the word the is just popping through there all the time, and it permeates our consciousness. It gives us this false sense of security that we know the answer, that we know the truth, the reason, the explanation. And we can go through our lives in this sort of illusory sense of security that there's no justification for whatsoever.
It's actually a disability.
It's a form of mental illness. It's a form of brain damage as I see it. That's why I tell people that they're brain damaged, and so am I, but I'm in language rehab. I've been working pretty hard to reprogram my language machine so that whenever the word the comes out of my language machine, I usually hear it. Sometimes I don't, but I usually do. And then when I hear it, I'm in a position to decide whether it's incorrect or correct. See, sometimes the word the is correct. It's not always wrong. But my studies indicate that it's wrong about 90% of the time. 90% of the time, if we used a or an or some other kind of construction, that it would leave the situation far more open and useful for thinking. So that's the number one stupidity, and actually that's enough in itself to bring about the change, I think. I mean, the other ones are minor compared to that one.
I'm at stage 1 in this. I can admit I've got the problem, and that's the first stage.
Yeah, that's the first. And I'll tell you how you can proceed. There's a very simple way to proceed. Now that you know it, and you have acknowledged that you're brain damaged, and that it is possible to do something about your brain damage, what you can do is, if there's any politician or philosopher or religious person on the media that you can listen to that you don't like, well, then listen to them. And record it, actually, and listen to the way they use the word the. If it's someone you don't like, then you're more prone to hear this stuff. You begin to train your brain to hear these words. So you don't have to really listen to their argument. You just listen to the word the. And then when you hear it, then play it back and listen to that part. And then ask yourself, did they consciously choose to use that word? Or did their language machine just put it together that way for them because that's the way they're programmed? And then they believed it because that's what came out of their mouth. And therefore it must be true. And they're brain damaged like the rest of us. It's not like they're evil. They were damaged when they were children by their parents, by being taught English the way they were taught and the way we've all been taught. You can spend a couple weeks doing this, just, maybe 10, 15 minutes a day. There are plenty of places on the internet where you can listen to people on YouTube and stuff. And spend like 10 minutes a day just listening to people that you disagree with and listen to the way they use the word the. The reason I suggest that is because if you do that for a couple of weeks, well, and it may not even take a couple of weeks, it may not take any time at all, because eventually what's going to happen is you're going to start hearing it coming out of your own mouth. And that's when you know you're beginning to really get it. It's easy to hear somebody else abuse the, but you already caught yourself once using it. So that's the thing is begin to notice how your own language machine automatically throws the word the in there for you. And there is a lot you can do about it. You can begin to reprogram your language machine, but it begins by becoming aware of it and actually getting that voice in your head isn't you. That voice in your head is just your language machine, and it's been badly programmed. And once you begin to observe it and pay attention to it, that puts you in a position to reprogram it yourself, so that either the word the doesn't come up as often, or when it does come up, and this is really good enough, when it does come up, you hear it and are prepared to reformulate it if it's important or necessary. And you can just see how people use it to justify their self-righteousness. When they think they know the truth. They know how the world really is, the way it is, the answers, the explanations. Well, let me give you the other 4 stupidities, because they're relatively simple and don't require, 3 of them are really simple and don't require any real explanation. They're also quite common. Actually, before I do that, I want to get a URL and put it in here. Hold on. Okay, if you'll go to that link, what I want to talk about is one of the stupidities called reification.
Okay.
And it'll say do it for you, so you don't actually have to randomly pick them. If you just say do it for me, it'll do it anyway.
Okay, yeah.
And now if you would read that, I'd be interested to see what it says.
Okay, yes, the title is The Wisdom Machine, Superstition and Judgment. There is no coherence without tradition. The time fast approaches when production will no longer be able to withstand the forces of humility. Until now, people have been content with mere truth, but now we must move beyond temptation to equilibrium. For we must always remember that the fundamental force behind simplicity is not defiance, but virtue. And of course, we all know that the convergence of participation and insanity leads inevitably to greater faith. The age of reason has arrived. Which side are you on?
Oh, that was a good one. I like that one.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, now, the reason this works is this is an example of the problem of what I call I didn't make this word up. I don't even know where the word came from. The word is reification. And what it talks about is there's a problem in the noun structure of English. Do you remember what you were taught about what a noun is when you were in grammar school? In America, we were taught a very specific little mantra. A noun is a person, place, or thing.
Yeah.
So it's like almost everybody in America will just automatically regurgitate, a noun is a person, place, or thing.
Yeah.
But that's just simply not true. It depends on how you want to define the word thing. See, I would say that in order for something to be a thing, then you have to be able to put it in a bucket. It may be a big bucket, like a mountain is a thing, but if you had a big enough bucket, you could put the mountain in the bucket. But words like these in this reification problem, novelty, science, judgment, compulsion, reality, tragedy, illusion, those are not things. Yeah. There is no such thing as love. There's no such thing as knowledge. There are, those are words, just like the word spoon is a word that refers to this thing on my desk here. And then we have these other words like knowledge and reality, but there is no thing that you can point to and say, there's humility, because it's a word of a different order of reality. It's about relationships between things, not about things themselves. But the problem is, in English, that distinction is lost. And people get into arguments about what democracy is, or what science is, or what truth is, or any of these things. See, if you and I have an argument about my spoon here, I'll bet you any argument you and I have about this spoon, if you and I were both here in the room together with this spoon, we would have no more argument. Because we will be able to resolve that argument by looking at the spoon itself and deciding what makes sense. But if we have an argument about democracy or freedom or the future or economy or any number of thousands and thousands of English words, there's no way to settle the argument because there is no thing for recourse to. But because people don't think about it in those terms, people actually look for love the way they look for their keys. Like there is some such thing as love. Then somehow, or they wonder, they ask themselves, I think I'm falling in love, or I think I'm in love. Like there's some objective, now he's in love, he went over the edge, now he's in love. This is all part of the fantasy world that we live in. These illusions, these relationships between things are treated as though they're things in themselves with their own properties independent of our evaluation. And that's just simply not true. That's about as crazy as you can get. And that wisdom machine thing, all you got to do is listen to Alex Jones or any philosopher or any politician, and they love these kinds of words. They're full of emotions. And people respond to these things, but they have no actual meaning at all. It's almost like if I say x plus 7 equals 10. Is that true or false? Well, it's not true or false. As long as x is in there, it doesn't mean anything.
Is that these words are labeling things that we don't understand?
Not things. No, they're not things. That's exactly the point. I know it's hard. Well, no, don't feel bad because it's hard to talk about it. How else do you talk about it? We say, well, they're things that aren't things, but they're not things. They don't even exist. See, what they are is words. This is really quite simple. If someone wants to know what love is, it's real easy. Love is a word. Love is a word that people use to mean all sorts of things. And it depends, what do you mean when you use the word love? I love pizza, and I love my dog, and the word love means whatever you want it to mean. But again, people don't think of it that way. People think that they know what these things really mean. They think they know what democracy really is. As though democracy had a set of attributes like my spoon has a set of attributes. Democracy has no attributes that I don't give it in my own language machine. So reification is another one of the stupidities, relatively easy one. And if you notice, if you look on that word list, many of those words have very clear noun endings that mark them as reifications. They end in ty and cy and tion and enc. And a lot of them have very typical endings that clue us into the fact that they are reifications. A good place to listen for all this stuff is, especially the word the and reification, is when somebody's having an argument. If you disengage from the substance of their argument, and that was what I was going to say also, is that all these reifications, the is almost always the default value for any one of them. Because we love the feeling of security it gives us, the resolution, the vitality, the evil in the world. Now I have the certainty or the happiness. A or an just sort of somehow feels weak to us. We want to feel more secure than a or an. We like the. Did you have a question?
These are things that, when you're exposed to it, are so blindingly obvious.
Yeah. The thing is, you've already known everything I'm going to tell you, except for one of them, you already know. But the thing is, you don't know that you know it. And there's a big difference between knowing something and knowing that you know it. Now that you know these things, it puts you in a whole different position. You already knew this thing. Yeah, right. Yeah, let me give you two more that are really obvious, way more obvious than this, but one we don't think about very often is dualism, two-valued logic. We love to divide the world up into two mutually exclusive opposites. Is he a good king or a bad king, Daddy? You hear it all the time. Is it this or that? The word or is the key. They present a choice between two mutually exclusive opposites. It must be one or the other. The problem with this is, and there are some cases where the world really is divided that way, but the problem is they project this dualism out into the world as though the world itself is actually divided into good and bad, or light and dark, or whatever. When in fact, two-valued logic is an aspect of my analysis, not the world itself. The world isn't divided into good and bad people. It's my analysis that goes out there and grabs people and puts them into one box or the other. The world itself isn't divided that way. It's an aspect of the system I use to analyze the world. So the problem with dualism, and with the next one also, is that we project our own thinking out into the world and then treat the world as though it's actually divided along the lines of our own analysis, which is just as crazy as you can get. Imagine if science was stuck with the concepts of hot and cold. Well, duh. That's okay. If you live in a climate where it's really cold, and you could say, is it cold or hot today? Well, that might be all right, but for general descriptions or a first approximation. But for science, no. You use, an infinitely graded scale. And then you don't care whether it's hot or cold. It's 34 degrees centigrade. Who cares whether it's hot or cold? It's just what it is. So it's a good debating technique, and people use it, again, because they'll try to divide the world into two really mutually exclusive opposites and make you choose between them, and then they set it up so one of them is just obviously stupid and wrong. So that you only can really choose the one they want you to choose. Anyway, that's a relatively simple one, and you already knew this. But again, once you begin to see this, and especially as you listen to other people speak, and you realize that it comes out of their mouths, out of their language machines totally automatically, but then they end up believing it themselves. They actually believe that the world is divided into good people and bad people, or whatever situation they're in. They end up thinking that this projection of their own mind is projected out into the world, and then they treat the world as though it's really that way. And that's just crazy.
Would you say then it's fair to say that our language has created our political systems, in the sense where we in the UK have Conservative or Labour, or you have Democrat or Republican? Would you say that's down to language?
Nothing's ever quite that simple, but that's certainly part of it. The thing is that language, it's not the reason. Yeah, very good. But language touches every aspect of human behavior: family relationships, business, science, politics, religion. There's no area of human behavior that isn't touched by the insanities of language. So it's there everywhere. Occasionally, two-valued logic is correct. It's almost never correct in the physical world, like in sciences, but it is often correct in the human-made world. For instance, it is true that you are either married or you are divorced. And that act is defined as a certain legal thing. When a certain paper gets signed by somebody, you are married. And there's no in-between. There's nothing vague about it at all. You're married when that piece of paper gets signed. Now, maybe it's vague while you're signing the paper for 2 seconds. It's indeterminate. But once you've signed it, that's it. You are married. And then once you get a divorce a few years later, and once that paper gets signed by somebody, then you are no longer married. Even dead, death is no longer that simple anymore. It used to be sort of simple, and sometimes it is. I mean, if you're blown up by a stick of dynamite, I guess you're dead. There isn't much question about that. But I mean, there are a lot of subtle cases now where it's not clear at all. But again, in the human world of ideas and in mathematics and places like that, two-valued logic has a place. In logic, in lots of places, two-valued logic is okay. It's just that it's not okay in almost all circumstances having to do with our sensory experience. It's almost never true. Okay, so we've covered 3. The word the, which is the most important and obvious of them, reification, dualism, and the next one, again, is something obvious and simple as dualism. I mean, like I say, there's nothing you didn't already know about that. And there's same with the next one, absolutism. The words all, every, no, none. Anyone who says something about all Frenchmen or all anything is just nonsense. It may be 99.5%. Absolutism is almost always wrong, but it is true in the human-invented idea world and in mathematics again, where absolutes can apply. It's just that, again, when you're trying to talk about your experience in the real, not the real world, but the perceptual world, where absolutism fails almost always. I wouldn't say it's always wrong, because that would be a stupid thing to say, but it's almost always wrong. So that's a real simple one, though. And again, all of these things, when you listen to Alex Jones, the two-valued logic, the absolutism, the reification, the word the, and the beauty of this is you don't even have to begin to deal with the actual substance of an argument. You know, you can cut all sorts of nonsense without ever even looking at the substance of an argument. I mean, all these words invalidate whatever the hell they're talking about. It doesn't make any difference what they're talking about. Okay, so that's 4. The 5th one is problematic, and it's not easy to explain. It's easy to tell you how to deal with it, and it's the concept of identity. And the way it actually works, and this goes back to Alfred Korzybski's book, Science and Sanity, which is really the central idea, or one of the central ideas. Listen to me, the central. See how easy that just came out of my mouth?
Yeah.
It just flowed right out without me even thinking. But that's what we're up against, how unconscious our language machine is. That stuff still just comes flowing out of my mouth without any problem at all. In Earthling, English minus the 5 stupidities, there is no verb to be. The word is, am, are, was, all that, except as helping verbs. Occasionally they're okay. But you can't really say what something is. And if you think about it for a minute, it becomes quite obvious. If you and I are driving down the street and you point to a tree and say, what is that? And I say, oh, that's a palm tree. What do you know now about that tree that you didn't know before? Nothing. All you know is what it's called. You've been told that I call that a palm tree, but you don't know anything about it. If you want to know something about what that tree is, you're probably going to have to go to Wikipedia and learn a little something. And we say, if I tell you my next door neighbor is an asshole, clearly he's not really an asshole, but you know what I mean. But actually, if I told you that he beats up his wife and kids and his dog, and he stays up till 4 o'clock in the morning playing loud polka music, and he hasn't mowed his lawn in 6 years, now I've told you what he does, and now you have some sort of picture about what I'm trying to say. But to just say he's an asshole tells you nothing. The verb to be is kind of tricky, and there are actually 4 different varieties of the verb to be, depending upon how it's used in a sentence, and I don't even want to go into any of that here. And it has some very heavy philosophical implications. The label for this is identity, and the very fact that I think that there is a me in here that's the same I that was here 10 years ago or when I was 3 months old, and now that there's some identity, some me that is identical, that flows through all of that, that's the same now as it was then, turns out to be, well, a nice little fiction that we've been living with for several thousand years. But again, that's tricky stuff for adults. It's easy for kids to just learn not to use the verb to be, and to, instead of say what something is, to talk about what it does. And in fact, there is a thing called E prime by a guy named David Borland, who just died recently. He was another student of Korzybski's who took Korzybski seriously and started doing his own writing without the verb to be. And he called English minus the verb to be E prime. You can look up E prime on Wikipedia, and he wrote all of his stuff without the verb to be. And one of the things that's kind of interesting about it is that it sounds kind of difficult, but actually when you read stuff that's written in E prime, it's amazing how few questions come up. Everything is simple. So, that is the grand tour of the 5 stupidities, the last one being the verb to be, eliminating the verb to be from Earthling, and it's known as, the principle of identity. So you got the word the, reification, dualism, absolutism, and identity. Those are the 5 stupidities.
It is so blindingly obvious.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
I would never have thought about it. Obviously, I've always known about it, say, subconsciously, but...
Yeah, you need to know that you know it. And again, it's almost horrifying as you develop. You'll begin to hear yourself saying all the stupidest shit. When I realize the stuff that comes out of my mouth, it's humbling. But I've been working on this for years, and I'm getting a little better, but I'm still in rehab. I still think that I'm brain damaged, and as showed earlier when I talked about the main point of Korzybski's work. So it shows you that I'm still brain damaged.
Because everyone else's language and speech has an influence on us, until the majority of people stop using it, we're never going to be able to get out of it.
And we don't need to. I think it's good enough that I catch myself. And of course, if your friends know about it, they can help you. You know, like Jason, he and I have been talking about this stuff for a couple of years now, and he occasionally catches me when I'm full of shit. And I catch him all the time when he's full of shit. But it's good because among a community of people, we can help each other. And I would also, by the way, I would highly recommend that you don't try to pull any of this shit on anybody about the word the or any of this shit. They'll just get angry. Unless you've got permission, unless they've asked you for your opinion on all these things. If someone's abusing the word the and you start saying, well, but that's not the reason, they're just going to think you're a complete idiot and they're going to be angry. So I would caution you to hold your tongue.
I'm very inquisitive, so I think I might have to just test it just to see.
Well, yeah, actually, I'd be interested to see. Maybe it's just my own style that gets people pissed off. Maybe you can get away with it and they'll love you for it.
I'm certainly going to give it a go, but yeah.
Well, try it on people you don't know very well. Don't try it on anyone that you really care about right away.
No, I won't. I think I'm going to try it with someone who I don't like. I think.
There you go. Or someone you just meet and you're never going to see them again or anything. You know.
Yes, I don't really care what their opinion is.
See, the word the is appropriate sometimes. Listen, if you go blind in one eye, it's possible that you'll go blind in the other eye. And that makes sense. And in fact, that particular example was the first time that I realized that I had actually reprogrammed my own language machine. I was a big fan of boxing for years, and there was a real famous boxer called Sugar Ray Leonard. I don't know if you've ever...
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, you do know who he is? Okay. Well, anyway, he retired because he had a detached retina in his eye, and so he had to retire. And then like 2 years later, he'd had surgery on the eye. He decided to come back and start boxing again. And a lot of people thought that was a really bad idea. And I was explaining to somebody this, and I said to the guy, a lot of people are worried that if he gets hit too much, he already had it in one eye, and he might get a detached retina in another one. And that was what just automatically came out of my mouth. And the guy I was talking to looked at me like I was crazy, and I heard it come out too. And I stopped too. As the minute I heard it, another eye. How many eyes does this guy have?